Hello, at 1,000 subscribers, I will make a special series of stories for you. The road to Dead River ran like a split lip across the high desert, scabbard with stones and the prints of 1,000 hooves that had come and gone with the seasons. The twins Levi and Luke Carter followed it, by habit more than hope, keeping to the ragged edge where mesquite threw thin, spider-limbed shadows that offered more company than shade. The afternoon sky was a white-hot sheet, and the ground held heat the way a skillet holds a grudge. Every step lifted a little cough of dust that stung their raw throats. They had been moving for 2 nights and a day, always at the edge of a run. Their bodies carried the tally of it. Levi's ribs were banded in purple beneath his shirt, a bruise the size of a skillet where a rifle butt had met him. Luke's left ankle was swollen and angry, stuffed into his boot like a fist inside a glove. The canteen they passed between them clanked hollow, the last mouthful of water moving around like a coin in a tin. Behind them, the world they knew lay blackened at the edges canvas wagons, torn open like bellies. Bedrolls slashed, a cooking fire kicked into a scatter of red eyes. That picture kept jumping at them from the corners of their thoughts, the way a jackrabbit jumps late from a bush you thought was empty. The men who had left it that way were not ghosts. They were very real, and they were hunting. "Can't be far now," Levi said, cutting his words short to save spit. He was older by 8 minutes, and carried those minutes like a badge no one could see. When he spoke, even hurting, he sounded like a boy who had learned early to keep answers, ready for a father with little patience and less time. Luke didn't answer. He was listening the way animals do, with his whole body tilted toward the horizon. He had a trick for picking out sounds, one that had made him good at finding calves caught in arroyos, and good at hearing when trouble changed its shirt. He heard the dry tick of cholla spines brushing pants, their own labored breaths, the flit of a kestrel on some invisible errand. Somewhere much farther off, the faint note of iron on iron, horse gear knocking itself in rhythm, so faint you might mistake it for memory. They left the road and slid down into a wash that lay pale as old bone. The cottonwoods that lined it were chewed down to frayed green stumps, the mark of cattle that had wandered desperate the last time the rains forgot their part. A thin ribbon of water showed in the deepest bend, more mud than mirror. Luke stripped off his bandana and soaked it. He lifted it carefully. "Don't swallow the mud," he said out of habit, as if to someone smaller than him, then offered the sopping cloth to Levi first. Levi was already scooping prickly pear pads with his knife, slicing the spines off against a flat rock and shaving the thinnest bit of flesh into his mouth. "Tastes like a cross between rain and a promise," he said, voice flat, and Luke almost smiled at the old joke. They stayed under the bank until the light shifted. Afternoon slid toward evening with the slow grace of a freighted wagon easing. Downhill, heat let go its petty grip. A breath of wind shivered through the cottonwoods, and in that moment the desert felt like it could forgive anything. "Do you think he's dead?" Luke asked suddenly. He didn't look at Levi when he said it. He was watching the sky take on the faintest tinge of brass, always a step ahead of night. Levi wiped a line of mud from his lip with the back of his hand. He didn't like the shape of the truth, and didn't trust his voice with it. He could still see their father, Elias Carter, lurching backward as the first shots popped in the camp, his hat leaping from his head like it wanted no part of what came next. He could hear their father's last words, too, "Run, and don't look back," which was just his way of saying he loved them in a world where you didn't say such things unless the ground itself was on fire. "I think we do what he said," Levi answered at last, "and we do it till we can't." Luke nodded once. They climbed out of the wash and back to the road, avoiding the prints of men who might be reading prints in return. They moved with a switchback caution, shoulders low, eyes busy. Every hill they crossed did not show riders behind them, and still they didn't breathe easier. The desert liked to keep its jokes private. They made camp only when true dark found them, a miles-wide blanket thrown over everything at once. It came fast, and with it the stars thousands, cold and brilliant, so close the boys could almost believe their mother's voice when she used to say each one was a nailed-down miracle. They tucked themselves into the lee of a volcanic boulder. Levi set out a tiny fire that would not be seen from a distance and thumper into flame, sheltered behind rocks, just enough to kill the damp in their boots and cook a strip of jerky soft. Coyotes sang somewhere far off, voices overlapping in a rough chorus that sounded like broken laughter. Luke counted the quavers like he was reading a ledger. He had grown up with numbers in his head cattle, days between water, cartridges left. They were down to 5 cartridges and 3 hopes, and the cartridges were the only ones that would answer when called. "Well," Luke said, rolling onto his uninjured side, "if I ever get asked what I did this week, I'll say, ran a lot, and didn't die." Levi poked the coals and let out something that might have been a laugh if it hadn't started life as a cough. "Keep to the easy parts," he said, and rested his head on the rolled coat that served as a pillow. He didn't sleep long. Dream and waking were stitched too close together. The smallest sounds woke him, the tick of cooling stones, a moth's soft madness against the brim of his hat, the faraway jingle of tack that didn't belong to them. He touched Luke's shoulder, 2 fingers gentle on his brother's shirt. Luke came awake without a word and without moving anything important. They lay still as lettering, while the jingle grew and thinned and grew again, skipping along the ridges like light. When it didn't settle on them, they let breath out with such care it was hardly there at all. At first light, they were moving. Again, day laid itself down in sheets of color straw, copper, and a fierce white that made both of them squint and square their hats. A hawk traced loops overhead, hunting for something unwary. The twins kept an even pace and an uneven hope. On a low shelf of land, they found sign that made Luke stop. A cigarette butt, still damp, with a lip print deep on one side. A boot heel marked with a half-moon notch where a spur's rowel had chewed. And near the edge of a seep, a muddy horseshoe. With an old crack at the toe, Luke crouched, pointed. "That's Calhoun's Bay," he whispered. He knew it because he kept track of things people didn't think were worth keeping track of. How a horse limped when a shoe was set crooked. How a man tilted his head before he lied. Levi's hand went instinctively to the revolver at his hip. He could feel the weight of it, feel the smallness of its comfort. His father had said, once and again, that a gun was a last word you should avoid getting to, like a curse in a church, or a promise you can't keep. But the world had turned under them since then, and Calhoun had taught a different lesson with fire. They left the seep without drinking, hatred making a fool's bargain with fear. The country opened after that. Low country gave way to higher, peppered with pinene and juniper that smelled like clean smoke. Wind came down off the distant. Hills with a taste of metal in it, and the sky built a stack of cloud in the west, as if rain were a story it might be ready to tell. The road split at a cairn one arm, dropping toward a salt flat that shone like old glass, the other lifting toward a scar in the hills. Levi took the climbing arm. "High ground sees farther," he said, and Luke didn't argue. By noon, the sun had turned mean again. Luke's ankle began to sing at him, not the friendly kind of song, and Levi's breath had a catch in it he tried to hide. They rationed their words with the same stinginess they gave the canteen. When they did speak, they stuck to simple things, the names of birds, recipes their mother made that turned poor cuts into Sunday supper, the ways their father was wrong about small things and right about big ones. Speech laid planks across, the air between them, and they walked that bridge instead of the road for a while. They came to the edge of a canyon. It was a sudden wound you didn't see until you were standing there. Wind pushed up from its throat, cool and sure. A narrow path corkscrewed down, carved by water that wasn't there anymore, but remembered itself in the shape of stone. The twins followed it with care. The canyon floor offered shelter and a straight shot east. It also offered an echo that could carry their footfalls to ears they would rather not serve. They moved like men, trying not to think of the fall. Lizards skittered ahead of them in quick, contemptuous dashes. The walls wore stories in their stripes, floodlines, soot stains, old ash from cook fires long cold. Luke stopped once to touch. A smooth, dark handprint set into the rock older than their father, older than anybody they knew. It was the first human thing he'd seen all day that didn't look like trouble. They walked in the canyon until the light that fell from above began to thin to ribbons. When the walls let them out at last, the land beyond was different. It was opened, the way a hand opens when it has to. There, laid against the horizon, like something a man could hold if he wasn't careful, the town of Dead River showed itself. It wasn't much. No western town ever was until someone sang about it after the fact. A line of buildings, false fronts and dreams nailed together, stood along a street that had never made up its mind about being straight. A church with a steeple that leaned, a little as if listening to a side conversation. A blacksmith's yard where the ground was hammered flat by 1,000 shoes. A mercantile with a porch that invited tired men to be tired. A livery stable with a roof of patched tin that winked at them as if to say it had seen worse. And the saloon, of course always a saloon, its lanterns already lit though the sun hadn't lost its argument yet. Someone had painted a sign over its door in a hand fancy enough for a wedding. Blue lantern dot between the twins, and that promise stretched 100 yards of road, and a handful of people who move the way people move when they're waiting for a knock they don't want. A woman in a calico dress gathered a child closer with one hand and lifted a basket with the other. 2 men outside the blacksmith's wore their pistols, where they were easy to reach and tried to look like the reaching would be easy too. A dog slept under the rail, but had one eye open, because a smart dog knows when not to trust sleep. Levi and Luke stepped into town, like men stepping onto a new floor testing the creek. Heads turned to measure them. The boys must have looked like something the desert had spit out dust from hair to boothiel, shirts stiff with blood that wasn't all theirs, eyes too old for their faces. No one called out. The silence was the kind that covers itself all the way up. They made for the saloon, because light pulls, and because water was always more than water inside those doors. Levi felt the line of his father's knife along his belt, the weight of their last coins in his pocket, the means to buy one night of safety if safety could be had by the glass. He could feel Luke's limp grow more pronounced beside him. He could feel the town's stare like a new shirt that didn't fit yet. They were 10 steps from the saloon's porch when the air changed. It has a way of doing that sudden, like the breath before a cough. The shadows stretching across the street thickened into something that wasn't weather. A shape unhooked itself from the dark and stood up tall. He was big. Not circus tall or mountain tall, but big the way a long day is big more of him than you think you can take in. His coat was the gray of oncoming weather, the kind of coat a man buys once and never sees the need to replace. The brim of his hat was wide enough to shade an argument. He had the look of a man that cattle went around without being asked. His boots were sensible and terrible, the kind that had learned to end things. When he moved, it was a slow thing, as if there were music no one else could hear. He didn't carry a gun that showed itself, but men like that didn't have to show much. The town's silence bent around him, as if it had found its owner. Levi felt Luke's fingers brush his sleeve, a boy's signal and a man's both. "You seeing this?" He didn't answer. He could see fine. The stranger's eyes were a pale, cold color that didn't belong in heat. He looked at the twins the way a stockman looks at cattle that have pushed through the wrong gate, assessing not just what they were, but what had driven them. He didn't come closer. He didn't have to. He filled the space between the boys and the saloon like a door you weren't sure you wanted to open. "Evening," he said at last, his voice low and broad. It rolled out and settled where it needed to without wasting any. The word wasn't a welcome or a warning. It was simply the time of day, named and made to mind. Levi found his own voice somewhere behind his teeth. It came out a little raw. "We're looking for water," he said, "and a place to sit." The man tipped his chin a fraction, like a nod that might grow up later. "Dead River's got a little of both," he said. "Sometimes at the same time." Luke swallowed. He'd been lining up the pieces in his head, how the man stood, the way he didn't blink, the way the town let him occupy its air. He had heard stories, everybody had, but stories were thin in the face of a man whose shadow could blanket your troubles. The name came to him not as a whisper, but as a certainty that had been waiting its turn. The giant rancher, Luke breathed. So low, Levi wasn't sure he'd meant to say it out loud. Something passed through the men outside. The blacksmiths and ease, and a tightening all-at-once proof that names can do two things at the same time. The big man didn't acknowledge the title, which was acknowledgement enough. The boys stopped 3 steps from him, close enough to see the stitching on his coat, the careful mend along one sleeve, the clean line of a scar that crossed his knuckles, and disappeared under the cuff like a snake going to ground. Close enough for him to see the cuts on their faces, the crusted scrape along Levi's cheekbone, the way Luke took his weight off his left foot, like he was sparing it feelings. The big man looked from one to the other and back again, as if reading a ledger and trying to decide what debt was written there. Behind them, the sun let go and the lamps along the street took up the business of making a world. Music started inside the blue lantern, a piano picking out a tune that had learned to live with missing keys. Somebody laughed too hard at something that wasn't that funny. A bottle broke somewhere it wasn't supposed to. Life, in other words. Big man shifted his gaze once more, and the slight movement pulled the boy's fear up where it could be seen. It must have pleased him or troubled him, maybe both, because something softened at the edges of his eyes. "Before you sit," he said, "you'd best tell me what's riding with you." A wind ran down the street then, quick and cool, and lifted the dust in a twist that rose between them like a question made of ground. Levi felt his throat close on words. Luke's mouth found a fragment of prayer that wasn't to any particular. Heaven. They spoke at the same time without meaning to. "Please," Levi began. "Don't," Luke said, the rest a whisper inside his hurt. Night pressed in. The town listened. And the giant rancher waited, solid as a gate you can't dodge and too honest to lie about where it leads. They stood in the middle of Dead River's one good street, with the night coming on like a tide. The big man coat the color of weather, had brim broad enough to shade a lie filled the gap between the twins and the swinging doors of the blue. Lantern. Levi's mouth worked around air before it found words. "Please don't beat. We are already injured," he blurted, and it came out smaller than he meant. The plea of someone who had already learned too much about what a man's hands could do. The big man didn't so much as blink. The town's quiet bent toward him as if it were used to taking his shape. He looked the boys over like a brand inspector. Bruises tally-marked across Levi's ribs beneath a torn shirt. Luke's left boot bulged where an ankle had swollen against leather. Both faces chapped and wind-burnt, the kind of wear that comes from running hard with too little water and not enough luck. "Not here to beat," the man said at last. His voice rode low, a freight train sliding past in the dark. "I mend what can be mended. I cull what can't." He tipped his chin at the saloon. Food first, talk after. He stepped aside, and the night seemed to move with him. Inside, the blue lantern was all golden lamplight and noise trying to sound like cheer. A piano stumbled bravely through a tune. Cards slapped felt. The long mirror behind the bar held a crowd of tired faces twice over, as if Dead River had twice the men and half the sense. The boys drew every eye that mattered. A woman with sleeves. Rolled to the elbow Mags Callahan, who ran the place like she'd negotiated with God and got a discount, took one look and jerked her chin toward a back room. Kitchen, she told the big man. Less eyes there, more stew. He nodded once. Mags. They passed through a swinging half door into a low room where heat cooled. A stock pot worked itself into a lather on the stove. The smell beef and onions sweetened with a pinch of something from a jar came at the twins, like an embrace they didn't trust yet. The rancher set them at a rough table, slid a bucket over with clean water, and dropped a folded towel on it. Wash, he said. He spoke like the land few words. None wasted. Mags ladled stew into 2 bowls, as if she meant to drown whatever had chased them. Eat, she ordered, and put a heel of bread big enough to club a rabbit beside each bowl. And don't look at me like that. Nobody dies slow in my kitchen. Levi's hands shook around the spoon. Luke took a careful sip and closed his eyes when it hit his mouth. For a moment the world narrowed to something gentle. Then the rancher took a chair, and the world got serious again. Tell it clean, he said. Luke glanced at Levi. Levi gave a short nod that meant start. We camped by Little Dog Wash, Luke said. Down from the cottonwoods, where the water makes that bend like a crooked finger. We came in late, had a small fire low. No singing, no nothing. Pa. He swallowed. Pa was fixing the cinch on the dun. Said it was likely to gall if we didn't mind it. Then we heard a bird call, wrong for night. One of those whistles men do when they want to sound friendly and don't. Then fire came out of the dark torches first, then shots, then men. How many? The rancher asked. 8, Luke said at once. 2 on paints with white socks. 1 on a flea-bitten gray. 1 on a bay that drags his right foreshoes cracked at the toe. 3 more I didn't get to see full. Their leader's got a jaw, like it tried to heal wrong, and gave up. Scar splits it, so his grin looks crooked. Even when it ain't. Mags made a small sound between her teeth. The rancher's eyes stayed on the boys. Guns? 2 Henrys, Levi said, steady. Rest had Colts. The leader Calhoun, they called him, wore his left low, tied down. He chews Mizia twist. And spits neat. The big man drummed 2 knuckles once against the table, the only sign he'd heard the name. They took Pa first, Luke said, voice thinning to wire. He shoved us toward the dark and said, run and don't look back. We ran. We didn't look back until the shooting stopped and the fire sounded wrong. Levi's hands couldn't decide if they belonged to him. He twisted the towel once, twice, then set it down before it tore. We hid the first night in Lava Rock. Second night we moved canyon to canyon. Saw a cigarette butt this morning, still wet. Spur heel with a half-moon notch. Same bay's print near a seep. You're sure Calhoun's riding? The rancher asked. I'm sure, Luke said. He's hunting the last of us on account of something Pay wouldn't say yes to. What's something? Levi's jaw tensed. Pa didn't tell. He said it wasn't our debt. He shot a look at the rancher. Daring judgment. The big man's face didn't move, but the room felt like it had shifted a degree. Calhoun likes 2 things, he said. Light he didn't strike, and fear he didn't earn. He's taken both from men who should have known to step away. He won't step away, no. Not while the trail's warm. Mags slid a crock of beans onto the table in case stew and bread weren't enough to make boys remember the world had more than running in it. She stood a beat longer than she needed. "Your pa?" she asked, soft as Mags got. Levi held her gaze because he'd decided to be the kind of boy that held a woman's gaze even when it hurt. "Dead," he said. "We didn't see him fall." He left the rest where it belonged. The door banged dead. River Sheriff Doyle, thin as a fence slat and twice as weathered, hat in his hands until he remembered to put it back on. He scoped the room, found the rancher, and let out breath. "Heard the Carter boys come in," he said, trying to sound official. "Heard they brought company in their shadow." The rancher didn't rise. He didn't have to. "You got 2 men worth half a fight, Doyle?" 2.5 if you count Perkins," Doyle said. "I don't count Perkins." He peered at the boys as if they might change the numbers. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough," the rancher said. "Calhoun's likely inside an hour if he read the land right. He'll want to hit while the dark's still doing him favors." Doyle licked his lips. "I can wake the bell. Get folks to the church." "No bell," the rancher said. "Sound carries. We'll pull the lamps down and make the street look like it died yesterday. Mags, no music, no bottles. Give your piano the night off." Doyle posted Samuels behind the livery and put Hendricks on the back steps of the Mercantile. "If Perkins sobers, sit him on the roof with a scattergun and tell him to count to 10 between breaths." Doyle bristled a little at being told, which meant he was relieved. "And you?" he asked, as if he didn't already know. "I'll be in the street," the rancher said, "where Calhoun can find me." The sheriff looked like a man about to argue with a grizzly over honey, decided against it, and left rattling orders. The rancher turned back to the twins. Up close, the pale of his eyes was stranger, the color of creek ice at dawn. "2 things you need to know about this town," he said. "We don't start fights, and we don't leave 'em half done. That's my law. I keep it because nobody else will, and because men like Calhoun don't understand anything softer." He hooked a thumb toward the door that led through the kitchen to a narrow yard out back. "Come on." They stepped into air that smelled like onions and horse. The yard ran to the livery shadow, where a pile of chain lay coiled like an iron snake links heavy as a fist, the kind used to lock gates against a flood or hold a bull that liked its own mind. The rancher picked up a length, lifted it, like it weighed less than it did, and laid it easy over one shoulder. "Why a chain?" Luke asked before he could stop himself. "Guns talk too much," the rancher said. "This talks just enough." He glanced at Luke's ankle. "You're not running on that. If you try, you'll fall when it matters." "I'm not picking you up when it matters." Levi's mouth tightened. "We can fight," he said. "We ain't dead wood to be leaned on." The rancher's gaze took him apart and put him back together. "You'll get your fight," he said, "but you'll get it where it counts, not where it kills the wrong people." He pointed to a low slot beneath the kitchen porch where supply barrels lived. "You 2 bed under there when the trouble starts. You see boots you don't know. You pull back farther. You see mine. You hand up cartridges if I ask. That's your job. You do it well. You live to have another." "We ain't hiding," Levi said through teeth. The rancher looked at him as if at a colt that hadn't figured fences yet. "You're not hiding," he said, and his voice didn't raise, but somehow filled the yard. "You're staying alive. There's a difference. My law starts with this: no man hits what can't. Stand up. Second part says if a man does anyway, he meets me. Which part do you want to help with?" Levi wanted to throw something heavy at the night and yell that he was done being young. Instead, he swallowed and nodded once. Luke reached out, touched the chain on the rancher's shoulder like he might learn its weight by osmosis. The rancher called without turning, "Parsons." The blacksmith appeared in the stable doorway, arms black to the elbow, apron scored with a map of hot mornings. "Boss?" "Sand 2 sacks and lay 'em across the mercantile roof line," the rancher said. "Samuels'll need it if they try for the back. And give Doyle your quiet hammer." Parsons grunted assent. "You think he'll know how to use it?" "Doesn't matter," the rancher said. "A hammer does most of the thinking." Mags came out with a bottle of something amber, not whiskey, something medicinal with a bitter scent, and a roll of linen. "Doc ain't here yet," she said. "He's halfway to Red Mesa, pulling a tooth out of a man who won't pay after. I can bind an ankle in my sleep." She knelt and wrapped Luke's swelling with the efficiency of a woman who'd set bones at a chuck wagon and kept men from bleeding on her floor. Luke hissed once and bit the inside of his cheek until he tasted copper and steadied. "There," Mags said. "You can cuss me tomorrow. Tonight you can thank me by staying where Harlan—" She caught herself, shot the rancher a quick look, and amended, "Where the boss tells you." The rancher's eyes flicked to Mags, then away. If the name had stirred anything, only the night noticed. Doyle reappeared at the yard gate, breathless with responsibility. "Lamps down all along the street," he said. "Everything looks like a funeral. Hendricks says he can't see his own hand." "He doesn't need to," the rancher said. "He needs to hear. Men lie. Horses don't. You hear a horse breathe wrong, you know if the rider's got a heart like soup." Doyle frowned as if he were adding that to a short list of things he understood halfway. "You sure he's coming, boss?" The rancher lifted the chain from his shoulder, handed it to Levi, and took it back again in one motion that said weight matters. "Feel it. Calhoun doesn't pass up a straight line," he said. "Those boys are a straight line. I could draw him with a stick, and he'd still find it." He turned to the twins once more. In the yard's dim, the lines the sun had carved into his face were gentler. "Eat again if Mags lets you," he said. "Then under the porch when the music stops. If you feel the ground talk, it's hooves on hardpan. If you feel it stutter, it's fear. You'll learn the difference." Levi found he wanted, very badly, to ask the man's name. Instead, he asked the thing that had been gnawing his belly since the wash. "Why help us?" He said, "We ain't your brand." The rancher considered the question the way a plainsman considers cloud a sign, a promise, a lie, depending. "A town that lets wolves eat at its door is a town that belongs to wolves," he said. "Dead River belongs to folks who pay their tabs and bury their dead right side up. That's my law, too." A corner of his mouth moved, not enough to be a smile. "And I knew a man once who died saying, 'Run and don't look back.' Didn't much care for the men who made him say it." He stepped toward the street, chain over his shoulder, shoulders set in a way that made the air get out of his way. At the edge of the yard, he paused, as if remembering something he'd meant to say a long time ago. "You asked me not to beat." "You," he said without turning. "I don't beat boys. I beat the things that try to make boys into ghosts." Then he was gone, a shadow taller than other shadows, taking the law with him where the street narrowed into night. In the blue lantern, the piano faltered and went quiet of its own accord, like it realized it had been playing the wrong song. Lamps lowered across town until Dead River looked emptied out and older. The wind slid along the rooftops and took gossip with it. Somewhere out in the dark, a horse blew through its nose, a soft huff that said, "I'm here." Mags pushed 2 more, bowls across to the boys without asking if they had room for them. "Eat fast," she said. "You fight better full." She looked them both over, and her voice smoothed to something like a blessing. "You mind him. The boss has a way of making men into the best parts of themselves, or showing them what the worst looks like up close." The twins ate because a woman had told them to. Then they slid under the porch, bodies pressed to the cool earth that smelled like spilled flour and old rain. Levi loaded the Colt's slow, counted rounds he'd already counted, and set them in a line on the sill where his hand could find them by feel. Luke lay with his ear against the ground, listening for the story the soil would tell, a story of hooves and speed, and which direction a man's heart leaned when he rode towards something mean. Out in the street, the shape of the big man took its place where men could see it if they tried. The silence changed again, deepening, as if the town had pulled breath in and would not let it out until someone earned it. Dead River was a hinge that night, ready to swing toward one of two futures. The law that mattered did not sit in a book on Doyle's desk. It walked the street with a chain over its shoulder, waiting for a man with a bad jaw to come learn how it read. The night gathered itself over Dead River like a blanket pulled too tight. No lamp glowed in any window. No boot scuffed the street. The silence was a thing you could taste dry, metallic, charged as if lightning prowled just beyond the horizon. The boys lay flat beneath the kitchen porch of the Blue Lantern, backs pressed to earth that still held the day's heat, listening with every inch of their bodies. Not Luke had his cheek against the ground, eyes closed, letting the soil speak. It told him things other men missed: the distant drum of hooves, the faint stagger of one horse favoring a cracked shoe, the restless shifting of animals uneasy with their rider's intent. He counted 6, then 8, then lost the thread when they fanned out across the land. His breath hitched. "They're here," he whispered. Levi tightened his grip on the Colt. He had loaded it twice already, counting each round like prayer beads. 5 shots and no spare cylinder, but he had memorized their weight, their promise. His jaw clenched so hard the muscles ached. If they come this far, I'll fire until the world runs out of echoes dot above them. The Blue Lantern had gone still as a tomb. Mags crouched in the dark kitchen with a scattergun across her knees, her silhouette steady against the pale square of a window. Doyle and his 2 deputies were somewhere in the shadows beyond, perched behind barrels or tucked on rooftops, rifles aimed at the black mouth of the street. Every man and woman in town was awake, though none dared cough, none dared shift a chair. The whole of Dead River was holding its breath, and in the center of the street stood the giant rancher. He was outlined only by starlight, but his shape was enough. The tall figure, broad-shouldered, a length of chain looped over one arm. He stood loose but not careless, as if the ground itself had asked him to keep it steady. His presence was the only sound the town allowed itself. Then came the riders dotted first, only the creak of leather, the whisper of hooves through sand. Then shapes slid into view at the end of the street, blacker than the night that held them. Torches hissed to life, small suns flickering above each horse's head. Their glow threw teeth and guns and the broken grin of their leader into view. Calhoun got the boys sucked in air at the sight of him. The scar ran from his ear to the corner of his mouth, twisting his smile into a sneer that never fit. His face, his hat brim was cut sharp, his duster flared with each movement of his horse. He rode as if the saddle were part of him, like he was born to it and born to ruin. When he laughed, the sound was half rattle, half mockery. "Well, well," Calhoun called, reining his horse mid-street. His voice carried like a whip crack. "Dead River, you gone and tucked your tail? Not a lamp to greet us? Not a bark from a dog? Shameful manners." The rancher said nothing. Calhoun leaned forward in his saddle, torchlight throwing hollows across his scar. "We come for the Carter brats. Hand them over, and maybe we let your little town live to drink tomorrow." A long breath of silence followed. The town didn't answer. The rancher didn't move. Calhoun's grin spread wider, uglier. "You deaf, giant? Or just tired of carrying that chain around like a widow wears black?" He spat into the dirt. "Give me the boys. Last chance." The rancher's voice rolled out low and measured. "You've had your chance, Calhoun. Twice, maybe 3 times. It ended when you set fire to a man's camp and made orphans of his sons. The riders shifted uneasily, glancing at one another. The name Carter still carried weight, even in the outlaw corners of the territory. Calhoun barked a laugh, though it rang too loud. Orphans? I make 'em every day. Ain't no law here to say different. He pulled his revolver free and let it dangle loose at his side, muzzle down, finger grazing the trigger. Step aside, rancher. Your size won't stop bullets. That was when the rancher moved, not quick, deliberate. He lifted the chain from his shoulder, the links rattling like iron rain. The sound filled the street, louder than torches, louder than the restless shuffle of hooves. This is my law, he sighed, and his words sank into the boards and stones as if carved there. In Dead River, we don't hand boys to wolves, we don't bow to fire, and we don't let your kind ride free. Calhoun's smile cracked. His men cursed, hesitated, and then, because hesitation was poison gunfire, split the night. The street exploded. Rifles barked from rooftops, pistols thundered from the shadows. Horses screamed and reared, their riders fighting to hold on. A torch dropped, sending sparks crawling up a porch post. One outlaw toppled backward, rifle clattering, blood spraying across his horse's flank dot. The rancher strode forward into the storm. The chain whistled through the air and caught a rider across the chest, yanking him out of the saddle like a sack of flour. Another swung his pistol, but the rancher was already there, smashing the weapon from his hand with a backhand of iron. The outlaw crumpled. Levi pressed himself against the dirt under the porch, hands shaking around his Colt. He wanted to fire, to leap into the fray, but Luke grabbed his arm hard. Not yet, Luke hissed. Not unless it's him. His eyes burned. He meant Calhoun. Calhoun himself was a shadow weaving through the chaos, firing into windows, cursing when his men fell faster than he liked. His grin was gone now, his scar twisting with anger. Show me the brats, he howled, spurring his horse down the line. Show me the Carter pups, or I burn you all. The rancher met him in the center of the street. For a heartbeat, everything slowed. Calhoun raised his revolver, muzzle flashing in the firelight. The rancher swung the chain, a dark arc through the smoke. The shot cracked, echoing across the desert, but the rancher was already inside it. The chain snapped tight around Calhoun's chest and arm, dragging him half out of the saddle. His horse screamed, bucking sideways, torches flaring. The boys' hearts slammed in their ribs. Luke's whisper was raw, desperate. Now, he'll kill him. But the rancher didn't kill. Not yet. He tightened the chain, yanked Calhoun from his mount, and slammed him into the dirt hard enough to rattle the street. Calhoun spat blood, still clawing for his gun. The rancher's boot came down on his chest, pinning him like a wolf trapped in its own snare. Gunfire ebbed. The outlaws that weren't dead were fleeing, spurring their horses into the dark, leaving their leader writhing beneath the rancher's weight. The torches sputtered out, leaving the street lit only by stars and the faint glow of smoldering. Wood Dot the twins crawled forward from under the porch. Their legs trembled, their faces streaked with dust and sweat. They looked at Calhoun, gasping and snarling under the chain, then up at the man who held him. Please don't beat. We are already injured, they whispered together. And this time, the words were not for themselves. They begged for mercy for the man who had destroyed their family. The rancher's eyes, pale as morning ice, softened in the dark. He eased the chain just enough to let Calhoun breathe, then glanced at the twins. Mercy's your law, he said quietly. Tonight it's mine too. He bound Calhoun's wrists, lifted him like a sack, and threw him at Doyle's boots. The sheriff stood blinking, then found his voice. Cell hold him till daylight. The rancher straightened, bloodied but unbroken. His shadow fell long, across the ruined street. The fight was done, but Dead River knew the war was not, and the twins, trembling, alive, understood that fear had not ended with the night, that it had only learned a new shape. Dawn crept slow over Dead River, reluctant to show its face to what the night had done. The first light came pale, a weak wash of gold across the rooftops, dragging the smoke of burned wood into long streaks that looked like scars on the sky. The air stank of powder, sweat, and fear left too long in the heat. The street was a graveyard of noise now spent. Rifles cooling, shutters creaking, horses stamping nervously in their pens. A half-dozen bodies lay where they'd fallen, sprawled, in poses only death can arrange. Doyle's deputies were dragging them one by one to the edge of town, muttering about shallow graves and buzzards that wouldn't wait long. And in the center of it all stood the giant rancher. He was cut and bloodied, his shirt torn across the U. Shoulder, but upright, as if the night had been nothing but another job the land asked of him. The chain still hung loose from one hand, its links dark with something more than dust. His eyes, pale and unreadable, fixed on the man crumpled in the dirt at his feet. Scarred dash jaw Calhoun, bound, bruised, and spitting blood between his teeth. Calhoun was a man shorn of the fire that had made him feared. The scar that twisted his face now looked like a mark of desperation rather than strength. His men were gone, those who weren't dead scattered into the desert with fear knotted in. Their guts. For the first time, Calhoun looked small. The town gathered, slow and cautious, like folks approaching a snake that had already lost its fangs. Mags came first, sleeves rolled, scattergun dangling in one hand, though it wasn't needed anymore. Doyle stood behind her, his badge askew on his vest, hat clutched nervously. A few merchants, ranch hands, and women with sharp eyes trickled out, forming a ragged circle. The twins came last. Levi helped Luke limp across the street, his brothers, arm draped heavy across his shoulders. They were pale from exhaustion, faces streaked with grime and smoke, but alive. When they saw Calhoun bound beneath the rancher's boot, they froze. It should have been a sight to rejoice over. Instead, their hearts wrenched in ways they didn't understand. Levi's fingers tightened around his Colt, but he didn't raise it. Luke swallowed hard, his voice a whisper broken by the weight of 2 nights without rest. "Please don't beat. We are already injured." The words drifted out, weak as breath on glass. They weren't begging for themselves anymore. They were pleading for the man who had killed their father, hunted them like animals, and burned the last of their family to ash. The townsfolk stirred, shocked. Doyle sputtered, "Boys, you can't after what he's done." But the rancher didn't move. He looked down at the twins, the chain still resting in his hand. His pale eyes softened just enough to make the morning light catch. "Mercy," he said, voice deep as a canyon. "It's rarer steel than vengeance." He lifted his boot from Calhoun's chest. For a long moment, nobody breathed. Then he turned, yanked Calhoun to his feet by the ropes that bound him, and shoved him toward Doyle. The sheriff staggered, almost dropped him, then blinked at the rancher like a man surprised to still be alive. "Lock him," the rancher said. "Let a judge decide how long he rots. If there ain't a judge, then let time do the work. Either way, he dies a prisoner, not a legend." Doyle nodded, fumbling for words that wouldn't come. He and his deputies half-dragged, half-shoved Calhoun toward the jail, the outlaw cursing weakly in a voice stripped of its bite. The crowd shifted, murmured. Some looked relieved, some disappointed. Blood demanded more blood in the West, and the sight of it withheld was something towns weren't used to seeing. But no one dared speak against the rancher. His word had become law in Dead River long. Before the night's battle, and now it was carved deeper than ever, Mags exhaled slow, wiped a hand across her face, and muttered, You'll scare me into church yet, Harlan. She caught herself and bit her lip, but the rancher gave no sign he'd heard. The twins came forward haltingly. They stood in the center of the wreckage of the street, the smell of gunpowder still clinging to their clothes, and looked up. The man who had stood like a wall between them and death. Levi spoke first. You could have killed him. Ended it for good. The rancher met his gaze, steady. Killing's easy. Makes the night quiet. But it don't change what boys carry in their bones. You kill him. You keep hating him. You spare him. You start learning something harder. Luke's throat worked, but no sound came. For 2 nights they had lived on fear, and for 1 night they had lived on hope, borrowed from someone else's strength. Now they stood in the light of morning, unsure of who they were supposed to be. The rancher put a hand on Levi's shoulder, then Luke's. His grip was heavy but not crushing. Your father gave you 2 things before he fell, he said. He gave you his blood, and he gave you his last words. Run and don't look back. You ran, that's one part. Now comes this other. You don't look back, not at him, not at what you lost. You look forward. That's how men get made. The boys nodded, slowly. Tears stung their eyes, but they did not fall dot around them. Dead River stirred. Women swept broken glass from porches. Men patched holes in wood where bullets had bitten. A dog nosed at the dirt and dragged away an outlaw's hat. Life, stubborn and ordinary, pressed forward into the daylight. The rancher slung the chain back over his shoulder. His work was not finished work, like his never was. But for now, the town had its mourning, the boys had their mercy, and the outlaw had his reckoning dot as he walked toward the edge of the street, his long shadow stretching west. The twins whispered together, voices soft but steady this time. Thank you. The rancher did not turn. He only raised one hand, a silent reply, before striding into the horizon where the desert waited with more lawless nights. And so, Dead River learned what kind of justice a man could make with nothing but his will, his chain, and his silence. Wild West remembered, as it always did, that survival was not just the art of the gun or the strength of a fist. It was the courage to keep walking after the nights of fear and to whisper mercy when the world only knew vengeance.